Good evening.
Good evening.
I would very much like to convey to you my thanks, my gratitude for the work that has been done in and around Melbourne since my last trip, the very evident progress and unfoldment of the work and of individual consciousness of those who are working, and of course particular thanks for the very evident love and care and affection that has been given to us personally on this trip, and the care that has gone into the preparation of the work. And I like to dwell on this for a little while because it has a special significance in the lives of students. You will remember that last night I spoke of our goal, the goal of God realization, the goal of arriving at a place where we are actually aware of a transcendental presence. We are actually aware of the fact that we're not living our own lives, that there is a something that has taken over and that goes before us and that cares for us. The attainment of this mind that was also in Christ Jesus is brought about primarily through our own effort, with of course the understanding that we would not be making this effort but for the grace of God. Now this will help you in your relationship with others, and more particularly with students, if you will remember that we have no choice. We have no choice as to whether we shall live the spiritual life or whether we shall not live the spiritual life. We have no choice as to whether we will follow a spiritual path or we will not. I can assure you that if we had any such choice, if mankind had any such choice, everyone would be on the spiritual path because the fruitage is so worthwhile. There's no other way really to attain harmony, lasting harmony, peace, quiet, inner joy, prosperity. There's no other way than the spiritual path. Nobody has ever attained it merely by the acquisition of health or the acquisition of wealth or the acquisition of fame. But nobody has ever missed it, and nobody has ever lost it that has found it on the spiritual path. Therefore, it is safe to say that everyone would be on the spiritual path because everyone is seeking safety and security and peace and quiet and prosperity and health and all the added things. But they have no such choice. We come to the spiritual life by an act of grace. We come to a class of this nature by an act of grace, not by our own will. No one is in this room tonight by virtue of his or her own will. It is because of a propulsion. It is because of a direction. It is because of a leading that comes from a source greater than oneself. If you were to speak to the people of this city about coming to this class, I'm sure that you would find that they're all busy with something very legitimate that makes it impossible for them to be here. And only you aren't that busy with something else. And that is not an accident. That is because there is a something bringing you, carrying you further and further along the spiritual path. Now, those who are further along on the path can tell where you are in consciousness, what degree of unfoldment has taken place, and to what extent you are going forward. And one of these ways has to do with this very subject of the reason for my thanks and my gratitude. And incidentally, it has to do with the entire subject of supply, the entire subject of our human prosperity. You will notice as others come to you for help, as others seek spiritual light, you will notice that there are three distinct stages that you can readily pigeonhole, name. The first one is when a person comes to a spiritual teaching for help. And you will notice that when they reach that point that they have been directed to a spiritual source, that they are quite eager for it. And that they will make efforts, that they will spend money, time, effort, devotion. But you will also notice this, that the effort, the time, the devotion, and the money is being spent for their spiritual progress. They are not thinking in terms of a teaching. They are not thinking in terms of a world seeking freedom. They are seeking primarily for something that will meet their own individual need. And you'll be very much surprised sometimes to find that they won't even make too much effort or give too much devotion or spend too much money even in seeking their own welfare. But the time does come when really there's not any amount of trouble that they won't go to, or any amount of devotion, or any amount they won't spend for that purpose of meeting their need. And this you will always notice in the first stage of a person on the spiritual path. There comes a second stage, and here you will discover that the young student has already found some measure of help, has received some measure of healing or harmony, and is beginning to think in terms of others, more particularly their family or their relatives. And that is when they begin to try to interest their friends or relatives, or they will buy books to give them, or they will pay for classes for them. They will be making efforts. They will be giving something of themselves for others. And the moment that you begin to see this, the moment you see them buying books to send to some friend at a distance or some relative, you can be assured that they have well entered the path, and that they will undoubtedly go deeper and deeper into spiritual consciousness, because in a measure they are now thinking less of themselves, less of their progress, less of their welfare, and they're beginning to take in others. They're beginning to share. When they come to the third stage, you will witness some of the things that we have witnessed here this week with some of our students. No longer is the idea, what can I get from this, or will this give me all that I need? By this time, enough has appeared in their experience so that it is virtually taken for granted. This is my way. This is what is producing in my life. And now begins the third stage, which is one of the most essential stages before we can come into the fullness of consciousness and the fullness of those things that are added. And that is where we are beginning to think in terms of the message or of the world. We are beginning to think, how can I give myself? How can I serve in some way that others may find a benefit from this work? How can I devote myself? In other words, there is now not a seeking toward oneself, but rather a seeking to give oneself, a seeking to devote oneself, a seeking to benefit the world. The world has begun to come into the consciousness of an individual rather than their own life, their own health, their own body, or even that of their own family. Now, universal consciousness has been tapped. That stage the Master describes as loving your neighbor as yourself. Now, there is no such thing on the face of the globe as a human being loving his neighbor as himself. A human being must love himself primarily, and his family secondly. And if it goes much further than that, you can be assured that the individual is breaking through humanhood, expanding out of humanhood, because humanhood is bound up entirely in its own welfare and the welfare of what it considers its own family, mother or father or sister or brother or child. And rarely if ever, does a human being's thought go beyond that. Sometimes it's compelled by community interest to support the Red Feather Fund or the YMCA or the Boy Scouts, but usually in the human state it is really done more or less under pressure and reluctantly, and not to the full measure of one's ability to do those things. It is only as the boundaries of humanhood are broken that we really commence to know that there are families across the track whose children do not get a summer holiday, or who do not have adequate clothing or schooling, and then we begin to be more public-minded. It isn't really being public-minded at all. It is now breaking past the bonds of humanhood into that spiritual state of consciousness which is love thy neighbor as thyself. Now, the miracle part of this is this. We all know, of course, that in the human scene, the struggle for existence is intense. The struggle to make an adequate livelihood. The struggle to meet one's bills on time and still have a little left over. The struggle to keep one's business solvent. The struggle to stay in the right atmosphere of competition. This is part of that limited human consciousness that can only feed upon itself. It has to rely on its own physical strength. It has to rely on its own education, personal experience, or even influence. This is all the limitation of humanhood. But there comes an inevitable period to those on the spiritual path when this struggle lessens, when life becomes more fruitful and the labor less arduous. And usually you will find that this period coincides with the second stage of development, when we are beginning to think of others, when we are beginning to think of sharing with others, when we are beginning to see that there are others in the world who have problems, and that perhaps as a neighbor we can help to do something about it. And in proportion as we begin to concern ourselves less with personal problems and entertain a larger mental atmosphere, one that embraces more of our neighbors, we begin to find that our business pressure lessens, our income increases, our actual worries lessen, our fears begin to die. And then, of course, there comes that inevitable third stage, in which we now begin to be so little concerned about our own demonstration, primarily because it's taking care of itself better than it ever did before, and we are beginning to embrace this idea of love thy neighbor. Now our neighbor is beginning to be somebody in another country, or those in other countries. It is beginning to be international relationships or national relationships. It is beginning to encompass the idea of a service, a giving, a devoting, in some way becoming a part of improving the world atmosphere, improving the lot of mankind, spiritually, sometimes in very human ways of service. And it is at this stage that you commence to notice the miracle. And by this time, you may wonder why someone hasn't told you about it before. But it is a subject of such a nature that those who really know cannot impart it to you until there is a response from within you, a readiness to receive it. Many of you know that in the metaphysical world, it is believed that it is possible to demonstrate supply. It is believed that there are certain prayers or treatments that will increase one's supply of money, or supply of business, or supply of opportunity. It is actually, for years it was believed and practiced, this attempt to give treatments to increase supply. On the whole, they have failed. On the whole, the movements that were built on them have failed. And the reason is this: there is no way, there is no known way through prayer or treatment, in the ordinary sense of the word, that will help one increase one's supply. Not all of the prayers, not all of the treatments in the world will do this. And there are reasons. The major reason, and this will take a great deal of meditation on your part to realize, the main reason is there is no supply in this world. None for you, none for me. There is no supply out here at all. All supply is embodied within your consciousness. There is none. None out here. Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. It is thine now. And it is embodied within you. It is closer to you than breathing. It is nearer than hands and feet. You never can increase it. Never. It is already infinite. It is already all that the Father hath. If it were ever possible to get more supply than you have, you'd be taking it away from somebody else to whom it belongs. And spiritually, there's no law that would permit this. The only bread that you can have is the bread that you cast on the waters. The bread that you cast on the waters is yours, and it will come back to you, and only the bread that you cast on the waters. What you do not give out cannot come back, because everything that everyone is giving out must come back to them. It is earmarked for them, and no one can touch it without burning their fingers. Now, once you begin to realize you are not a finite human being, you are actually the life of God in individual expression, and everything necessary to your experience is embodied within you. It is much like an individual seed. It contains everything within itself necessary to its unfoldment and development as a full-blown tree with fruit on it. You plant that seed in its native element, and within the seed itself is the ability to draw unto it from within its own being, like the spider and its web. And eventually, that seed, which seems to be so tiny, has become the full-grown tree by virtue of an activity that is within itself, that draws unto itself from its surroundings its particular need without taking anything from the tree next door or the plant. So with us, our good appears to us to come through outside activities, through a business, a profession, an art, through other individuals. Just as the seed supply seems to come from the ground, the sun, the rain, but actually all of this activity is contained within the nature of the seed itself, and all of this activity of our life is contained within our own consciousness. And even though we seem to be drawing money from dividends or business or investments or friends or relatives or services, nevertheless, it can't come to us unless we set in motion the activity of consciousness within ourselves that draws back unto us that which is already our own. And so it is that at the third stage of spiritual unfoldment, you learn a great secret. You learn that this very devotion, this very concern that others benefit, this very concern to be a part of an activity, or to be a part of a contribution, or to be a part of a service that is to benefit others beyond the realm of ourselves, this itself is the putting out of the bread that is to return to us. And so, at this stage, we learn the secret which every mystic has known. No mystic has ever failed to reveal the secret of supply. And the secret is not getting, the secret is giving. The secret is devoting. The secret is serving. The secret is outpouring. And it is only in proportion to our outpouring of ourself, of our qualities, of what we have, that the return can come in. In ancient days, this lesson was taught to the Hebrews in the form of tithing. And in modern days, there are some religious movements that still operate from the standpoint of tithing. And those who understand what they are doing when they tithe benefit tremendously and do find the infinite nature, the abundant nature of their supply. Others are tithing and receiving no benefit because they have a false idea of the meaning of tithing. When a person tithes with the idea that there is going to be a return, they have lost the entire benefit of tithing, and there is no return. Not only there is no return, but they even lose hold of that which they have given. So it is when a person, through their service, through their devotion, through their activity in a spiritual work or religious work, when they believe that there is to be a return to them for that, they have lost. They've really lost everything. It is only when this giving or serving or devotion is an outpouring of one's own love, one's own desire that others benefit by it, that it becomes the law of supply. And this is the reason that you can never teach the law of supply to your friends or relatives until such, or students, until such time as they give evidence of the fact that they have discovered it for themselves. The reason is that it is very apt to give the impression that if only they give, there will be a return, and then you've set them on the wrong path. Because by giving, there is no return, except when the giving is the spontaneous love that flows out from one, that compels them to be doing what they are doing. And this also explains your presence in this room. No one actually in the human scene could bring themselves here. It just would not be within the scope of possibility, and if they came, they would find it difficult to sit for an hour or two, because they are not being fed their own meat or wine or water. Therefore, those who are led to this message, or any spiritual message, must be led from within their own being. And this will show you why it is a most wonderful thing to give or send someone a pamphlet or a book or a letter or something that may show them that there is another way of life than the one they know. But rarely is it wisdom to go further than that, for the simple reason that until they themselves respond, this is not their path. The Master brought this out in his statement, "I have come to those of my own household," when a woman asked him to heal her daughter, and he refused. He refused. No, I'm not here to heal your daughter. I'm here only for those of my own household. In other words, those who are not seeking loaves and fishes, but who are seeking me, who are seeking God, who are seeking the spiritual way of life. Oh, eventually he gave in because of her much pleading and healed the child, but you have in this example his conviction that there are those of my own household, there are those who are ready for a spiritual light, others who are not ready for the spiritual light, and each must be permitted to go their own way. Now I go into this at length for this reason. See how it is in yourself so that you can be properly guided when others come to you, so that you will not try to force anyone into giving, sharing, serving, or devoting, but rather you will let the unfoldment come forth from within themselves, and yet you will recognize when you witness it taking place, you will know that your friend or relative or student is now really on the spiritual path and about to demonstrate that all that the Father hath is mine. It is all embodied within me. Now, this is important for you because the harmony, the peace that you have always sought, you will now stop seeking. You will now relax and give up your efforts to find peace, safety, security, prosperity, because you won't succeed unless you give up those desires and begin to realize the only legitimate desire is to know thee aright. Whom to know aright is life eternal. You can only have life eternal, which means divine harmony, in proportion as you come to know God aright. And this is the most difficult part of our spiritual journey. It has to be the first part, but it is the most difficult part because we have been fed concepts of God throughout our lifetime, and we have looked to those concepts of God to bless us. And the concept of God, regardless of how good it may be, can't bless us. We can only be spiritually blessed as we come to know Him aright. And that has no relationship at all to a concept of God. It is for this reason that we must start with the realization that there is no use of trying to define God or analyze God or seek to know in the mind what God is, because in that way lies failure. You can never know with your mind what God is. If you could embrace God in your mind, God would be smaller than your mind. And this can't be. No. We can begin to lose our concepts of God through our contemplation or meditation on the nature of God. The nature of God, which is quite different than God, just as you are a different being than your nature. You are you. Your nature is merely an outward expression, quality, or a set of qualities of you. But you are always greater than your qualities. You are always greater than your nature. You may have a kindly nature, you may have a philanthropic nature, you may have a peaceful nature, but that is your nature, that isn't you. You are still greater than these. So it is with God. You will not at this moment know what God is, because God has to be experienced in order to be known. God cannot be known with the mind or the intellect. God must be experienced. But you can experience God through an awareness of the nature of God, and this I would like to explain to you. The mere fact that you may have prayed to God for something is proof positive that you have not known the nature of God. For if you had known the nature of God, you would have known that God is not withholding anything from you. God is not withholding anything from anybody on the face of the earth. You would have known that there is no such God. There cannot be a God sitting around somewhere holding on to something, withholding something, or even withdrawing something. You can picture this for yourself using the sun as a symbol. The sun which gives off warmth and light. If you could try to imagine the sun someday being displeased with us and saying, I'm going to give you light today but no warmth, or I'm giving you warmth today but no light. And then we begin to pray, oh God, make that sun give us light today, make that sun give us warmth today. And then we have a ridiculous picture. And it is a ridiculous picture anytime anyone prays to God for anything, because they are saying in effect, come on now, you're withholding something I need, something you know I need, and something I've got to have, and you're withholding it. Come on, give it to me, give it to me. And it's like a child begging its mama for candy that isn't good for it, even though the child, of course, thinks it's good for it. Now, when you know the nature of God, you will find a relaxing in your whole mind and body. You will never make a mental effort to reach out to God for something. You will never get tense or tight waiting for God to give you something. You will never think in terms of a demonstration to be made in the future, because there are no demonstrations in the future. There is only this immortal living, this eternal moment in which you are living, in which you are life itself. And you are living life itself, but the life you're living is God. And it's an unlimited life, an infinite life, an eternal life, an immortal life. And therefore, praying isn't asking, praying isn't petitioning, praying isn't expecting something. Praying is a knowing of the truth, that all that the Father hath is mine. Son, thou art ever with me. This was said to a son who was mad at him. And yet he answered, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. The moment you begin to know the nature of God, you are finding life eternal. Why? Because you're no longer wasting your life away looking to God for something that you already are and you already have. Now, the wonder of this, when you begin to perceive the nature of God, the weight that drops from your shoulder, the burden that falls away from you, I do not have to get. I do not have to wait for. I do not have to pray for. I do not have to earn or deserve. And then you begin to understand why Christ Jesus said, God hath no pleasure in your sacrifices. Man was not made for the Sabbath. And you begin to understand. You've been sacrificing, hoping to please God. You've been doing something, hoping to please God. There's no way you could displease God. You are the image and likeness of God. You are the very manifestation of God's own being. You have no other mind than God, no other soul, no other life. In fact, your body is the temple of God. And therefore, and even if you are sinning or have sinned, neither do I condemn thee. Neither do I condemn thee. Thy sins are forgiven thee. So there's no waiting around in limbo. There's no waiting around to serve out so many years of punishment. There's no waiting of years to work out karma. You work out your karma in this very second in which you are listening to me. You break your karma in this very second in which you are listening to me, and you do it by knowing him aright. In other words, you must at this very instant be feeling a greater love for God than you've known before, because how can you help loving a God that isn't holding you in bondage to your past sins of omission or commission? How can you help loving God now that you know God is closer to you than breathing, nearer than hands and feet, and isn't withholding anything, hasn't anything in his power to give you, for it is all in you and with you and through you now. When Jesus says, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, he is telling you something that's utterly impossible, judging by all the concepts of God that we have been brought up with. A punishing God, a rewarding God, a God that makes us wait for our good, a God that holds us in condemnation for the very sins we committed that we couldn't help committing because he gave us the power to do the sinning. Oh, it's fantastic, these concepts of God that have been given to us and that we are entertaining and worshiping and expecting to get good from. It's a miracle that we're doing as well as we are. But we won't do better until we feel an inner relaxing in the realization, thank you, Father. All that thou art, I am. All that thou hast is mine. There's no future about that. There's not even a past about it. It has not to do with a man who lived 2,000 years ago, except that he did live and tell us this, and that we haven't listened. The truth he said 2,000 years ago is the truth today. Many people forget that if the truths he addressed, or if the truths he revealed, were only true about those to whom he revealed them, then it would appear that only the Hebrews in the world are children of God and are in God's grace, because that's who he was addressing this message to. But we know that he was talking to them and through them for all mankind, that every word he said to them was a universal truth that must be true about Christians as well as Hebrews. And it must be just as true about Vedantists, and it must be just as true about those of any faith or every faith. And to go a step further, it's just as true about atheists. The only thing is the atheists don't know it. The only thing is the Hebrews and the Christians and the Vedantists don't know it. That is all that is separating this world from life eternal, from universal peace and infinite prosperity. Do you know that there is enough good and goods in this world to supply everyone that is on the face of the globe without anyone lacking for anything? Everyone who is now on the face of the globe, and all those who are to come, could be living in infinite abundance with just what we have in and on and above the earth today. And what we haven't got, God has provided means for us to get. As you probably know, a machine is now in operation in Israel, which within a short time will remove every bit of desert and wilderness from that land, so that every inch of it will be fertile ground. Why? Because a godly man has discovered how to draw fresh water from the sea inexpensively. Another machine is in operation, or rather in manufacture, and when it is completed, it will begin to make roses grow in the American deserts, in the American wilderness. Hundreds of thousands of square miles that are not producing a blade of grass will be producing food for mankind. Why? Because God has given us everything. The airplane wasn't ever invented, it was discovered. There are laws of God that existed before Abraham was that make aeroplaning possible. Oil has been in the ground for thousands of years, and so is gold and silver. These are not inventions, these are discoveries of that which God has given us for our abundance. And there are enough secrets left, like this one of bringing forth fresh water from the ocean. There are enough of such secrets left to give us all an infinity of supply, if only we are willing to share it, if only we are willing to divide it, if only we are willing to let it pour forth. For supply is giving, sharing, outpouring, and that makes it incoming. But it can't begin until you acknowledge that God has nothing left to give you, that God has implanted in your consciousness the fullness of the Godhead bodily, and now you must turn within and draw it forth. Let it flow. If you want to compose music, you don't have to bother God with your desires. Turn within and find what you're seeking within your own consciousness. If you're interested in inventions, don't worry God about them. Turn within and find that God has already planted them within you, within your own mind and soul and consciousness, and you need only draw forth that which is there. Give it, share it, produce it. The mystical poet told us, open out a way for the imprisoned splendor to escape. That's the secret of living. Once you know God aright, you'll know that there is an imprisoned splendor within you that is infinity itself. It is eternality itself. It is immortality itself. It is abundance of all good. But it is within you. In the same way, there are those in the metaphysical world still trying to demonstrate companionship. They can't. They won't ever succeed. Not any more than our parents and grandparents succeeded in praying for it. It doesn't come that way. Companionship is something that is locked up within you. You have to open out a way to express companionship, and then you'll find a companion. But without expressing companionship, who wants you? What have you got to offer? What are you offering? To get something? That's not much of an offer. When you go to market to have something, give something, share something, and you will soon discover this. You have as much companionship within you as God has. And the first way to begin to express it is to begin companioning with God. The moment we begin to companion with God within ourselves, we find an infinity of companions on the outer plane. Until we have made our contact with the Father within, we do not make our contact with our rightful companions without. So it is at every stage, know Him aright. And the first knowledge of Him that you must have is God is not withholding. God has nothing to give you, and therefore open your eyes that you may discover the infinite nature of what God has stored up in you, and then open out a way for it to flow. Whatever it is that you're lacking, you're not really lacking. You have an abundance of it. You're merely lacking the ability to let it flow out from you. And you have to find a way to let it flow, to give it, to share it, to express it, whatever its nature may be. And when you do this, from the standpoint that you're not giving anything of your own, you're not giving anything of yourself, you're giving out of the infinite nature of God, the cruse of oil will never run dry. You will never lack money or companions or home or harmony. Once you begin to understand you have nothing of yourself. It would make no difference if you had $1 million and started giving it, it still wouldn't be yours. You are merely the temporary holder of it. You are the temporary possessor of it, the temporary trustee for it. And when you give, when you share, be very certain you know that you are being a transfer agent for the infinite source, the cruse of oil that never runs dry, which is pouring itself through you. Now, just as we know that God is not a giving God, so do we know that in an absolute sense God is not a forgiving God, for the reason that God never holds us in bondage to our errors. If you want to understand the nature of punishment, you must seek for it in a different direction, for God knows nothing about it. God is of too pure eyes to behold iniquity. Punishment, which is inevitable for wrongdoing of any nature, even that which is ignorantly done, punishment is the reflex action of the sin itself. In other words, there is no such thing as a sin and punishment. There is a sin which results in punishment, or there is a punishment which is a consequence of sin, but they are one. They are always together. And there is no way to sin and escape punishment, because punishment and sin are one. It works on the same principle of sticking your hand into an electric fan and finding your fingers cut off. There's no use of blaming the fan. It isn't punishing you in any way. No use blaming God. God isn't punishing you in any way. But sticking your fingers in that fan is just the opposite end, or rather the losing the fingers is the opposite end of sticking your hand in that fan. To avoid it, keep your hand out. And so with us, refraining from wrongdoing is an impossibility, because as human beings we were actually born with an equal capacity to do good and to do evil. That is what constitutes humanhood, is the belief of two powers, good and evil, and we are constituted of both. But while we can't refrain from doing evil, we can do good, and we can't both do good and evil. We can't do both good and evil, but good and evil can't occupy the same space at the same time. Therefore, when we are occupied in letting God's grace flow through us, there's no longer a capacity for evil. There isn't even a capacity to stick our fingers in the fan by mistake. It just won't happen. There isn't a capacity to have an accident. There isn't a capacity left for sin, disease, or death, or lack, or limitation, once we begin to understand that we are a transparency, an instrument for God's goodness to flow. We have no good of our own. Why callest thou me good? There is but one good, the Father in heaven. There is no wealth of my own. There is only the wealth of God, the substance of God, which is ours to share. There is no wisdom of our own that we can keep locked up in our own brain. All wisdom is of God, and it is up to us to let it share. There is no love that we can keep locked up within ourselves that belongs to us. Love is God, and therefore we can open out a way for this imprisoned love to escape. And in doing this, we overcome the karma of sin and of punishment. That is the meaning of the Oriental word karma, the result or reverse action of what we put in motion. Whatever we put in motion has a reverse action. Whatever of good we do returns good to us. Whatever of evil or wrong or error we do returns as that to us. When we realize, however, that I do neither good nor evil, I break the karma. When I realize that I have no good or evil to do, I break the karma. When I realize that I am but the transparency for God to flow through, that I am but the instrument for God's good to reach mankind, I am but the instrument for the blessing of my home or my family or my friends or my practice or my student body or the world. When I realize that I am but a point in consciousness through which God's grace is permitted to flow to bless those receptive and responsive to it, I have no responsibility for being good, and I have no possibility of being too bad. Oh, the little human faults that remain with all of us, certainly, because we're still a part and parcel of that ancient Adamic belief in two powers. But in the degree that we realize I can neither do good nor evil, I am but the transparency through which God appears. I am the instrument through which God's grace is flowing. Then I have no qualities of good or evil, and I have no good karma, and I have no bad karma. I'm just the spiritual offspring of God, being eternally the Son of God. And that's neither good nor evil. That's just being perfect. That's not bad either. Now, let us understand this. We are on the nature of God, because the nature of God means the nature of good. And because God expresses as individual you, good must express individually as yours. And since God is infinite, your good has to be infinite. And there's no room in your demonstration for anything less than infinite good, infinite abundance, infinite harmony, infinite life, infinite truth, infinite love. But it can only come as you understand this. God is not withholding. God is not to be sacrificed. God cannot be influenced. Not all of your tears and not all of your prayers is going to influence God, any more than it's going to influence the sun to give us more light or more warmth, or less light or less warmth. Whatever the sun is, it is. God is. God is. And God is now. And God is the same yesterday and today and forever. So there's no way of changing God. And there's no way of changing God's plan. And there's no way of influencing God. But you can bring yourself into harmony as the Son of God, as the child of God, by the realization, I of my own self can do nothing. I of my own self am nothing. Why callest thou me good? There's but one good, the Father in heaven. And then be willing that God's grace flow through you to your faraway neighbor as well as your near neighbor. That you be willing that God's grace flow to the sinner as well as the saint. Be sure that you don't make the mistake of limiting God to only those who you think deserve God, for there is no such thing. The woman taken in adultery, the thief on the cross, they were all given God in the moment that they turned to it and for it.